We're talking about history. Tomorrow marks 2 years since the World Health Organization announced that COVID-19 had become a pandemic. A lot has changed since then. So we're wondering, how do you think historians will write about the pandemic in the years to come?
I think historians will look at the pandemic as a turning point in all of our lives. Our lives will not go back to the way they were before. After 2 years of Zoom meetings and school from home, those parts of our lives will stay with us. Even as we return to classrooms, the use of electronic equipment, the connections we made, and the traumas that we experienced, the family members that we lost, that will not go away. We will be much more concerned and anxious about future pandemics in ways we were not before. And we'll also see that the social lives of people are very different. Young people were more affected by the George Floyd murder, being at home, seeing that from home, and their views of government and society will be different than those of their parents.
Such an interesting point, because I've even found myself saying, oh, pre-pandemic, or you know what I mean? It's just even saying pre-pandemic, and then you realize how much you change, and you realize what your values are and what you need to kind of let go of and what you need to hold on to, and the real stuff that matters. And it's really not the material stuff,
I think that's right. I think this has been a spiritual turning point as well as a professional turning point for people. They've questioned their lives, their relationships, and young people have had to confront mortality in a way that they normally don't. This has been a war, especially for many people who are dealing with suffering within their families, work changes, and that trauma will stay with them. There are some positive sides. I think people are learning to be more resilient, and I think they're learning to value members of their families and their communities in ways they didn't before.
Absolutely. And how do you think this will compare to how we're taught about the pandemic of 1918? When you look at the history books, you talk about that, and then you talk about this recent pandemic. How do you think they'll compare?
Well, this pandemic has had more than 1 million deaths now in the United States and tens of millions worldwide. It's been, in some sense, more deadly than the 1918 pandemic. On the other hand, we've been able to do things in our lives we weren't able to do then. We've been able to use credit cards and curbside dining and remain connected to people through Zoom and other technologies that did not exist in 1918. I think we will see this pandemic as even more transformative, because it's not just the suffering, but it is also these new technologies, these new ways of behaving that will replace the old. And I think we will see that this generation, the generation that grew up in high school and college during this period, this will be a part of them the rest of their lives. So it will not be a forgotten pandemic in the ways in which 1918 was often forgotten a decade later.
The next question is kind of a two-parter, because I know that you also write globally. So how will historians look at the pandemic in the United States, and will it be different globally?
I think historians will note the paradox that the United States, which is the wealthiest and best resourced country in the world, nonetheless suffered more deaths than many other societies with fewer capabilities. And they will comment on how the politics of the United States and the attitudes that crossed parties contributed to suffering that really was not necessary in many cases.
Jeremy, how do you think historians will talk about leaders in the pandemic, such as Dr. Fauci or the 2 presidents who have been involved? How do you think they'll be portrayed?
I think historians will be quite critical of President Donald Trump's administration. They will point to the overwhelming evidence that the administration often denied the science in front of it, and that it allowed its other concerns to often jeopardize the safety of many American citizens. I think Dr. Fauci and those around him will be seen as scientists who were trying their best, made some mistakes perhaps, but they will come through as models for scientists in the future. In fact, their experiences will be warnings to scientists and scholars and others to try to tell truth to power, to not allow politics to get in the way, and to be wary of the ways in which politics, even during a deadly disease, can undermine the effective safety of citizens.
That's so interesting. Against all odds. I mean, I saw from the beginning when Dr. Fauci was speaking, some people were like, we don't believe in science, and he continued to just kind of push and really stick to his beliefs, you know what I mean? And now you're realizing he was right. When it comes to just questions about, you know, history and the pandemic, is there anything else that I didn't ask you that you're thinking this might be something noteworthy?
I think one of the things that's important is we will have people from different kinds of groups writing about the pandemic. And so those from communities that suffered more, those were poorer communities, minority communities, and others, they will be part of the story. And I think it will be part of our larger discussion about civil rights, equality, and diversity. The pandemic will not be a side issue, it will be a central issue because it obviously affected people with different incomes and different experiences in very different ways. It highlighted and exacerbated many inequalities. And that will be something that particularly people from disadvantaged groups will write about in the future.